What do you call a man who killed his father? What do you call a man who helped a tyrant burn a city to the ground? What do you call a man who killed the very woman he loved? A villain, a traitor, something worse. That is how Westeros remembers him. But that is not where his story begins. It begins with a birth that was treated as a crime. A man born into wealth, power, and a name that could open any door, and despised by the father who gave it to him. A woman died bringing him into the world, and the most powerful man in Westeros decided who was to blame. Not the gods, not chance, the child. Small, misshapen, and above all, unwanted. In a house built on legacy, appearance, and control. He was none of those things. And from that moment, Tyrion Lannister was not judged by what he did, but by what he was. This is the story of how he lived with that judgment and what it cost him. To understand Tyrion, you have to understand the world he was born into. Not Westeros broadly, something smaller and more specific than that. A room in Casterly Rock, a father's face, the silence of a man deciding in the hours after his wife's death what the child who survived her was going to mean to him. Tywin Lannister had built something rare. Not just wealth. The Westerlands had always produced wealth. Not just military power. A dozen great lords could field comparable armies when needed. What Tywin had built was a reputation so carefully maintained that it functioned like law. The Lannister name carried consequence. The gold was real. The threat behind the gold was realer still. Every decision Tywin made, from the sacking of Castamere to the coldest dismissal of his own children's needs, served that reputation. He did not maintain the image. He had become it. Into that image, a dwarf son arrived. A lord's children are his continuation. Proof that the strength holds across generations, that the line is worth the fear it commands. Cersei was sharp and politically capable. Jaime was physically everything a knight was supposed to be. Tyrion was something the story had no room for. Not because he was stupid. Even as a small child, it was obvious he had inherited the family's mind fully. The quick reading of people, the memory that retained everything, the instinct for where pressure should be applied in any negotiation. He had all of it, possibly more of it than either of his siblings. But Tywin's world did not run on intelligence. It ran on the visible embodiment of Lannister power. And Tyrion, standing in any room, announced with his body that the story had a flaw. Joanna Lannister died in childbirth, and Tywin's grief, enormous, cold, with no outlet his pride would permit, calcified into blame. He never openly accused Tyrion of killing his mother. He communicated it through the texture of his attention, the way it moved past Tyrion to settle on Jaime, the way no achievement in the boy's childhood quite registered as achievement, the way the door to his approval was never slammed shut, but simply never opened. Tyrion spent decades knocking. Cersei read their father clearly from an early age. She understood that Tywin's conditional love depended on usefulness, and that Tyrion's existence complicated her own standing. Her hostility toward him was not arbitrary cruelty. It was self-preservation by someone who had learned to manage their father's perception of them carefully. Proximity to Tyrion meant proximity to the family's embarrassment. She maintained distance and sharpened her contempt. Jaime was different. He had warmth that Cersei did not, and some of it reached Tyrion. Inconsistently, in intervals, never quite enough to compensate for the cold between visits. Jaime could be genuinely kind. He could also let things happen that a more courageous person would have stopped. Tyrion understood both things and loved him regardless, because the alternative was loving no one in the house where he was raised. Casterly Rock gave him a complete Lannister education with none of the social standing that education was designed to produce. He read every book the Rock contained. He absorbed history, rhetoric, military strategy, the mechanics of governance. He studied his father from a distance with the careful attention of someone who knows he will never be close enough to learn any other way. By the time he was a young man, he understood power, how it accumulates, where it is fragile, how it is lost, better than most lords 3 times his age. He also understood, early, that knowing how a system works is not the same as being allowed to participate in it. There was a girl before everything else, a young woman named Tisha, encountered by chance on a road. She did not recoil at what she saw. She did not perform tolerance with the cruelty of someone working to suppress their instinct. She simply looked at him without the calculation that nearly every other person had brought to the same moment. What Tyrion felt in response was the disorientation of receiving something he had been told was not available to him. He married her in secret. For a short time, he was genuinely happy. That happiness was real, and he would carry the memory of it for the rest of his life, because what came next was designed to make him doubt it. Tywin found out and had the marriage dissolved. He told Tyrion the girl had been a paid woman, given money in exchange for spending time with him. Whatever the truth had been, Tywin replaced it with a version designed to wound. And then, with the precision of a man who treats punishment as instruction, he arranged something worse than the revelation itself. Something that took place in a corridor with his guards, and that Tyrion was forced to watch and then participate in. The details are not described here. Tyrion had believed briefly that someone had chosen him without a reason. His father replaced that belief with its opposite, the certainty that no woman would want him without payment. That genuine connection was not something he was allowed to have. The armor went on the morning after. It was made of wit, wine, and the performance of a man who had decided he needed nothing. It was excellent armor. It held for decades. There is a kind of intelligence that develops specifically in people who are excluded early. Not the intelligence of formal study or physical training. The intelligence of someone who is never quite let into the room, who therefore learns to read rooms more accurately than anyone else. Tyrion had that quality from childhood. What he built from it over the years between Tisha and the war was a defense system. The wit was not originally performance. It started as necessity. A small boy in a great house, surrounded by people who had already formed their judgment of him, learns quickly that contempt is coming regardless of what he does. The only variable is whether he gets there first. If he makes the joke before someone else can, he controls the moment. If he names the thing they were about to name, he removes their weapon. If his response is sharper and faster than the person who came to mock him, the laughter lands differently. He practiced this until it became second nature. Every sharp exchange in a corridor, every dinner where a lord's son said something he should not have. When Tyrion redirected the room before it could settle into cruelty, these were the result of a child who had understood early that his mind was the one thing no one could take from him. Once built, the reputation was real. He could shift a room's dynamic through argument, through a precisely timed observation, through finding the angle that made the assembled company see things differently. Lords who came to dismiss him found themselves engaged. Men who arrived to mock him found themselves responding, then genuinely replying, and occasionally rethinking their position. This was not charm. Charm requires the other person to like you. What Tyrion practiced required only that they find him interesting. And interest was available from people who would never extend warmth. He could generate it through provocation, through intellectual confrontation, through the comment delivered at exactly the moment it would land hardest. He learned all of it and used all of it. The jokes were a defense. Behind them was a man who still wanted his father's recognition and could not stop wanting it, no matter how many times it was refused. He read every book in Casterly Rock's library, partly from genuine curiosity, partly because knowledge was the one form of value that his body could not argue against. You cannot look at a man who knows everything and dismiss him on the grounds of his height. Before he entered a room, people already knew to be careful. Tyrion Lannister was not the thing his body suggested. He had the family's sharpness without the family's restraint, and engaging him directly was a gamble experienced men had lost. The wit required distance. Every joke was a controlled release, designed to change the atmosphere without revealing what was underneath, to make the room laugh rather than say something true. Armor worn without interruption eventually becomes indistinguishable from the person inside it. He drank, not as affectation and not simply as pleasure, though it was sometimes both. Wine was the most reliable method he had found for quieting the part of his mind that ran constantly, cataloguing every slight, replaying conversations, looking for the moment they could have gone differently. Wine reduced the availability of later examination. He visited brothels openly, having concluded that if people were going to talk about it, they should at least have nothing to discover. He entered those rooms honestly, which was more than could be said for most of the men who used them. What he was looking for, underneath the transaction, was what Tisha had briefly provided: the experience of being seen without the armor on. He found it occasionally. He paid for it, and not always in coin. At the court in King's Landing, the armor was tested seriously for the first time. He moved through it as a Lannister and was treated as a marginal one, which meant the name opened doors that the body made people wish had stayed closed. He watched. He learned the court's geography, who owed whom, who feared whom, where the real conversations happened, where performances were staged. He filed all of it. He watched Cersei manage the regency with genuine political skill, built on a method that required constant proximity to the king. Her power depended on controlling access to Joffrey. The moment that access was challenged, her position weakened. He observed this without satisfaction. She was formidable within the constraints of her strategy. The strategy itself was fragile. He watched Joffrey. Joffrey was not a puzzle. He was a straightforward result, a child given absolute power before the development of any restraint, raised in a court where every excess was accommodated, the product of a truth some suspected and no one could safely name. Tyrion could see exactly what Joffrey was and exactly what governing alongside him would produce. The armor he had built for corridors and dining rooms had no instrument for that problem. What he had was the armor, the reputation, the mind sharpened by years of exclusion, and the wound from a girl on a road that he had not resolved and would not resolve for 30 more years. Underneath all of it was a belief he could not seem to extinguish, that what he had to offer actually mattered, that the mind, the instinct, the capacity for useful work would eventually matter to someone who would find him useful. He could not tell whether holding that belief was wisdom or damage. He held it anyway, because without it, there was very little left. Every choice Tyrion Lannister made in the years before the war contains a question that his family would never have thought to ask. What is actually here, if you look at it directly? He went north to the Wall not because Tywin sent him, and not because the political situation required it. He went because the Wall existed, and he had read everything written about it. And reading about a thing and standing in front of it produced different kinds of knowledge. He had spent his life receiving the first kind at a distance, and had developed a need for the second. He wanted to see it. He had always been the person positioned at the edge. He understood from direct experience that the edges of things contain information the center is not receiving. The Wall had stood for 8,000 years, and the lords of Westeros had spent the last several centuries treating its garrison as a dumping ground for criminals and its warnings as stories told to children. Tyrion had been collectively dismissed his entire life. He recognized the pattern and did not trust it. Castle Black was a fortress in slow decline. Undermanned, undersupplied, its authority eroded by decades of southern indifference, its population drawn increasingly from men with nowhere else to go, rather than men with genuine commitment. The Night's Watch of the histories, disciplined rangers who had actively managed the far north, had become something smaller and more compromised. Tyrion saw this clearly and did not try to soften it, because the gap between a thing's reputation and its reality was territory he had been navigating his entire life. He did not condescend to what he found. He looked at what the Watch actually needed: money, political attention, some respect that would attract better recruits. In his season, as Hand, he acted on it. The Wall received genuine attention. Dismissing it was more dangerous than taking it seriously, and he had stood there and reached that conclusion himself. Jon Snow was at Castle Black. The meeting between them is one of the quieter, more important moments in the early story. Two people on a wall at the edge of the world, both defined primarily by what they were not. Jon, not legitimate, not quite a Stark, not entitled to the name he had grown up using. Tyrion, not the heir, not the son his father wanted, not the body the Lannister story required. They recognized each other as two people who had spent their life never truly fitting in with those around them. Tyrion told Jon to wear his bastardy-like armor, to name it himself, before anyone else could use it as a weapon. This was not abstract philosophy. He was describing the only strategy that had worked for him. Own the thing they use against you, and it stops being their weapon. It's worth noting that a man who has genuinely made peace with his situation does not need to advise others on surviving it. Tyrion was still doing it himself. The advice was accurate and also incomplete, because the armor he was recommending was the same armor preventing him from reaching the things he needed most. He had learned to survive contempt. He had not learned to stop needing approval. Jon used the advice in his own way for years. Tyrion used the meeting differently, as evidence that loyalty built from genuine recognition is more durable than loyalty built from obligation. Jon Snow had no reason to warm to a Lannister. He did anyway, because something real passed between them. Tyrion would keep building alliances this way for the rest of his life, looking for the honest exchange, the deal that did not require either party to pretend. The road to King's Landing was where Tyrion Lannister first discovered what he was when the family name stopped protecting him. The name had not disappeared entirely. He was still a Lannister, still carried the reputation and the reflexive wariness that the sigil produced in anyone with sense. But in Catelyn Tully's hands on that road, the name became evidence rather than protection. She arrested him on suspicion alone. No proof, no process, no examination of facts. Just the grief of a mother who needed someone to hold accountable, and a Lannister close enough to reach. The arrest revealed how completely the Lannister name had been doing his protection for him. He had moved through Westeros inside an invisible structure. The shared understanding, held by every lord and innkeeper he had encountered, that damaging a Lannister carries consequences. Catelyn removed that structure in a single order on a mountain road. What remained was a small man on a horse, surrounded by people who had made their decision about him before he spoke. He was afraid, genuinely, visibly afraid, in the way that any person in that position would be. But Tyrion had spent his entire life learning to function inside fear without surrendering to it. The habit held. He kept talking. He kept analyzing the situation. He treated it the way he treated every situation, as a set of conditions that could be read and worked rather than a verdict to be accepted. The Eyrie was designed to communicate two things: permanence to those who held it, and helplessness to those brought before it. A castle unreachable from below, its sky cells open on one side to the drop. Not locked cells, but cells where the prisoner had to hold himself constantly against the slanted floor or fall perilously to their doom. The cruelty was architectural. You were not chained. You simply could not relax, for to relax meant death. Each morning, a guard asked whether he would confess. Each morning, Tyrion refused and demanded to be heard. Demanded a proper trial, with evidence, with witnesses, with the procedures Westerosi law at least nominally required. He made this demand knowing it would not be honored, demanding it was the only instrument available. A man in a sky cell with no allies has nothing except the argument. He used it every morning. Lisa Arryn had her own logic. A woman who had been used badly by the people closest to her, whose grief had curdled into a need for an enemy, who ran a court that had calcified around her son's fragility and her need for control. She was not simply a villain. She was a woman whose judgment had been warped by real pain. But she had the power, and the trial she convened was designed to produce a specific outcome. Tyrion looked at that trial and found the one mechanism it was not designed to accommodate: trial by combat. His right under Westerosi law. A right the court could not refuse without the refusal itself becoming a verdict the whole realm would notice. He had spent years studying the law from the position of someone who could not rely on it to work in his favor. He knew where the cracks were. He found this one and put his weight on it. No knight in that hall would champion him. A Lannister, member of the wealthiest house in Westeros, could not find a single trained fighter willing to stand for him. The name had failed its most basic function. Whatever protection his birth was supposed to provide had reached its limit. Bronn stepped forward. Bronn was straightforward in the way that made him easy to trust. He wanted to know the terms before he picked up the sword. No performed loyalty, no appeal to honor, no sentiment. A transaction with clear terms, offered and accepted, with both parties understanding exactly what they were agreeing to. In a room full of knights whose honor was available to whoever controlled the Eyrie, this directness was clarifying. Tyrion had grown up watching the gap between what Lannister loyalty claimed to be and what it was. Bronn, who claimed nothing except competence and price, was in some ways the most reliable person in the room. Bronn won. He fought to kill rather than to demonstrate. His opponent, Ser Vardis Egan, had been trained for the former. Bronn practiced the latter. The difference was decisive. Tyrion walked out of the Eyrie. He did not leave quickly. He did not put the mountain passes behind him like a man who has narrowly survived and needs distance. He stopped on the road down and turned his attention to the hill clans, the mountain people who raided the Vale's lower lords and whom every Westerosi nobleman treated as a recurring nuisance to be occasionally suppressed. Tyrion looked at them and saw a negotiation. He offered them what they actually wanted: Lannister steel, Lannister backing, weapons and military support that no great lord had bothered to extend, because no great lord had needed to treat the hill clans as anything other than a management problem. Tyrion needed safe passage. He had no army immediately available and no gold to hand. What he had was the ability to understand what the hill clans wanted and offer it to them plainly. A Lannister, after all, always pays their debts. They accepted. The clansmen who swore to him on that mountain road were the same men who fought under his command months later at the Green Fork. Imperfectly, chaotically, but present and committed. He built that out of nothing except the willingness to treat people others had dismissed as worth talking to. He came down the mountain with Bronn beside him and a band of clansmen behind him. He had gone into the Vale alone. He left with something that resembled, in rough terms, an armed following, built not from gold or fear, but from the recognition that useful arrangements are available anywhere. Tywin received him at camp with the same flat acknowledgement he always gave. The clansmen were noted as a useful addition. What Tyrion had survived and what he had built from the surviving, neither was acknowledged. He could build loyalty from nothing, find the negotiation inside the problem, lead imperfectly but effectively. These were real capabilities that the realm was about to need badly, and the people whose acknowledgement he had been working toward his entire life would absorb the output and ignore the person who produced it. He understood this. He was not yet done trying to change it. That gap between what he understood and what he kept doing anyway is where his story lives. Tywin Lannister did not send Tyrion to King's Landing because he believed in him. He sent him because Cersei was governing alone. Tywin had watched Cersei govern long enough to recognize that her political instincts, sharp but reactive, built on personal threat and favor rather than consequence. He needed a functioning mind at that court. Tyrion was available, competent, and, crucially, expendable in ways that Tywin's own reputation was not. The appointment was a deployment, not an endorsement. Tyrion knew this. His father had told him plainly. This was a task, not a reward, a temporary loan of authority. Whatever he built would belong to the office, not to the man. He accepted these terms because they were the only terms available. Because underneath the clear-eyed reading of the calculation, the appointment was still the closest thing to genuine power he had ever been given. He was not going to decline it on principle while the realm was actively collapsing. Joffrey was on the throne, temperamentally cruel, politically catastrophic, surrounded by men who had learned to accommodate every excess rather than check any of them. The small council was managed by Littlefinger, who had been using the treasury as a personal instrument for years and who kept its actual condition known only to himself. Pycelle had survived 3 reigns by attaching himself to whoever held power and would do so again without hesitation. Varys gathered information in service of purposes Tyrion could not fully map. Cersei governed by controlling access to the king and would fight anything that shortened her reach. The city was a season from riot. Food prices were rising. The small folk were watching a war that consumed resources and gave them nothing back except conscription. The city watch, the gold cloaks, were loyal to whoever had last paid them, which meant they were loyal to no one in any meaningful sense. Tyrion looked at this and began working. His first moves were quiet and precise, which is the signature of someone who understands that a court disturbed too fast closes against the disturbance before it can take effect. He fed 3 council members 3 different false versions of a plan regarding Myrcella, then watched which version reached Cersei. When it did, he knew which man reported to her. He removed Janos Slynt from command of the Gold Cloaks before dawn. No drama. A ship to the wall, a replacement already arranged. Done before Slynt knew it was happening, and before Cersei could organize opposition. Their conflict was not simply sibling hostility, it was a structural incompatibility. Cersei's power depended on controlling access to Joffrey. Every direct line Tyrion created between the crown and a lord or institution shortened her reach. She understood this and fought it consistently. He understood it too, and kept creating those direct lines anyway. Because the alternative was a court that could only function with her as the intermediary, which was exactly the instability Tywin had sent him to fix. The Myrcella decision illustrates the difference between them directly. Sending Myrcella to Dorne was strategically correct. It created Dornish non-aggression at a moment when the realm could not afford another hostile front. Tyrion made the calculation and gave the order. He did not ask Cersei, because asking would have produced a refusal driven by personal feeling rather than strategic logic, and the refusal would have been wrong. He told her after it was done. She was furious. He absorbed the fury as the price of the correct decision. The wildfire was the hardest decision of his time as Hand. He found the caches already stockpiled, a dangerous reserve the crown had allowed to accumulate, managed by pyromancers who had been given resources and permission and had used both enthusiastically. He did not create the wildfire. He inherited the choice. He chose to deploy it at Blackwater because without it, the city would fall to Stannis. The calculation was correct. Stannis' fleet outnumbered the defense. The chain Tyrion stretched across the harbor converted a mass weapon into a directed one, trapping the fleet inside the kill zone before the fire was released. As tactics go, it was genuinely clever. But wildfire does not sort between combatants. It burned Stannis' sailors, and it would have burned anyone else on that water. The men who died in it had simply been in the wrong fleet on a specific evening. Tyrion understood what he was deploying, and deployed it anyway, because the alternative was the city's fall and everything that would follow from that. He filed the weight of the decision where he filed difficult things, and did not pretend it was weightless. His lover, Shay, was still in the city during the preparations. What had started as a hired arrangement had become something neither of them could name precisely. He was trying to protect her. The court's attention, once turned toward a Hand's paramour with malicious intent, would find material. She was, in her way, grounding him through the weeks before the battle, when the performance of confident preparation would require his full attention. He told her to call him her lion. She did. He stored it in the same place he stored everything that might not last. The night before the battle, he walked through a city that had pelted him with dung a season earlier, and that still did not love him. He was not fighting for their love. He was fighting because the city was full of people who had not made the decisions that brought an army to its walls, and those people would die if Stannis took it. And he was the man in the position to prevent that. He had not asked for the position. He had not been offered a choice about it. He took the responsibility anyway. The battle did not begin with fire. It began with a chain. It was the most purely Tyrion element of the whole engagement. Anyone with wildfire could send burning ships into an approaching enemy and hope for results. Tyrion saw the problem. Fire released early, in open water, burns some ships and scatters the rest. The scattered remainder still takes the city, so he needed to herd them, gather them together so whatever survived would not have the strength to win. The chain sealed the harbour mouth first, let the fleet compress into the kill zone, then released the fire into a space with no exit. It worked. Stannis' fleet was inside the chain before the first jar of wildfire hit the water. The fire moved across the surface in the way wildfire always moves, not like ordinary flame, which sailors know how to fight. It ran over wet hulls and spread between ships, and turned the black water into something that had no navigational logic and no historical precedent. The men caught in it had no training for what they were experiencing. Tyrion heard it from the Watergate, where he had positioned himself close enough to read the battle but clear of the fire's range. He watched the chain hold. He watched Stannis' fleet stop being a fleet. Then Stannis did not break. This was the variable Tyrion had calculated for but had not fully absorbed. Stannis Baratheon believed in the absolute legitimacy of his claim, with the kind of certainty that does not respond to the destruction of ships. He regrouped his surviving forces on the far bank and prepared a ground assault. The wildfire had not ended the battle. It had reduced the forces with which he would continue it. The defenders on the walls had expected the fire to end it. When it did not, the mood shifted. The Hound had already refused to go out. Joffrey, whose presence on the walls had been the most visible symbol of the city's intention to hold, retreated without ceremony, escorted by guards, without explanation. 600 men watched their king walk away from the fight. Tyrion understood what was happening from the posture of the men around him, not from military training. He had none in any formal sense, from the same instinct that had always let him read rooms. The room in this case was a wall full of men deciding whether the battle was already over. They were 30 seconds from concluding it was. He could have let it happen. He had not asked for this position. He had been given a job, done it well, and watched the people whose cooperation he needed undermine him at every turn. He owed the court very little. He went over the wall anyway. The speech he gave was not a conventional battle address. He did not invoke honor or Joffrey's righteous claim, or the glory of holding the walls. He told the men in front of him, frightened, cold, without a reason to stay, the simple arithmetic of the situation. If Stannis takes the city, everyone on these walls dies. The families in the streets die. There is no chivalric convention that protects the defenders of a city taken by storm. He was not offering glory. He was offering the honest assessment that the only available option was to go through the Mudgate together. Then he said he was going, with or without them. They followed. The fighting outside the Mudgate was not elegant. Tyrion was not a skilled fighter, and the sortie was not a controlled tactical operation. It was a desperate engagement by men who had decided in the seconds after the speech that fighting was preferable to standing still. They held the gate long enough for something else to change. Tywin arrived with the Lannister host and the Tyrell forces from the opposite side of the city. The battle reversed in minutes. Stannis, winning against the garrison, was suddenly losing against a fresh army twice his remaining size. He retreated. The city held. Tyrion did not see this. He was on the ground outside the Mudgate when a blade opened his face. Not an enemy blade, one of the gold cloaks in his own sortie, in the chaos of a night engagement. Who sent Mandan Moore was never proven. That he meant to kill Tyrion was clear enough. The cut went from one side of his face to the other. He went down in the dark, not knowing whether he would wake. He woke in a small, dark room, his face wrapped in cloth stiffened with dried blood. The pain was different from anything he had felt before. Not the familiar discomfort of his body, but something that announced itself with every breath as permanent. The scar would not heal away. Varys came to tell him what the morning looked like. Tywin had arrived. The battle was being attributed to the Lannister forces that arrived from outside the walls. Tyrion's role as Hand was over. His quarters had been reassigned. He was to move to smaller rooms. No mention of the wildfire, no mention of the chain, no mention of the speech or the sortie or the blade in the dark. No mention of 6 months of governance that had kept the city functional long enough for Tywin's army to arrive at walls that had not fallen. Tyrion lay in the dark with his ruined face and turned that over. He had saved the city, not cleanly, with wildfire that killed indiscriminately, with a speech built on arithmetic rather than inspiration, with a sortie that was desperate rather than heroic. The man receiving the credit had arrived after the decisive moment passed. The ceiling above him was not circumstantial. It was structural. He could govern, fight, save a city that did not love him. And the credit would still flow upward to the name, not to the person behind it. His father had decided what Tyrion was, and no amount of evidence to the contrary would change that decision. Power changing hands in a court does not announce itself with a declaration. It shows up in small things. Who is already in the room when you arrive? Whether the guard moves aside or makes you wait. How long the silence lasts before someone responds to what you have said. In the days after Blackwater, Tyrion felt the shift in the court's texture the way you feel a change in weather. Not one signal, but an accumulation of small adjustments that together described something unambiguous. Tywin was in the Hand's chair. He had always regarded it as his rightful seat. The campaign was won. The king was secure. The court had reorganized itself around the new center of gravity overnight, completely, without visible seam. That is what courts do. Tyrion moved to the smaller rooms without protest. Protest would have been futile, and beneath him. He moved his books and his wine and the few things that were actually his, arranged them in the available space, went to his seat on the small council, and watched. Tywin governed with the efficiency of a man who had long since concluded that sentiment was a tax on outcomes. Debts were addressed. Political alliances formed during the war were formalized and rewarded. Lords who had served well received lands and titles, and the visible approval of the most powerful man in Westeros, which was the currency the court ran on. Tyrion received a wife. His marriage to Sansa Stark was announced in the tone Tywin used for troop movements, a resource allocated to serve family interests, with no particular concern for the preferences of the resource. The Stark name, the Stark claim, the political value of a Lannister heir with Stark blood. These were the variables in the calculation. Tyrion's feelings were not. He had applied similar logic himself as Hand, constructing alliances that cost individuals things they had not chosen to pay. He knew exactly what this was. What he had not anticipated was who Sansa was. She arrived at the ceremony with the composure of someone who had learned, under severe pressure, to control what her face showed. She was young, younger than people tended to remember looking at her, and she had watched her father executed in public, spent months as a hostage at Joffrey's court, survived by becoming very still and very careful, and very good at performing the compliance that kept her alive while preserving, somewhere internal, the part of herself that had not yet been destroyed. Tyrion recognized the performance the moment he saw it. He had been giving a version of it his entire life. He did not press her. This was a deliberate decision, not an instinct. The position gave him the legal right to press, and choosing not to exercise it required the active overriding of what the position permitted. He told her plainly that he would not share her bed without her wanting it. He meant it, and he kept it. Calling this heroic would be wrong. It was decency at its most basic. The recognition that a person in total vulnerability is still a person, that possessing the power to harm someone is not the same thing as being justified in using it. In a court where men with far less formal power over Sansa had used whatever they had to do far more damage, his restraint was notable. It was also the minimum standard that a decent person would meet. The marriage gave him something he had not expected. The experience of trying to treat someone well inside a structure designed to make treatment irrelevant. He could not free her or restore what had been taken. He could make the specific part of the nightmare that involved him as bearable as its architecture permitted. He tried. She received his efforts with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned that Lannister kindness usually has conditions she has not yet been shown. She was not wrong to be careful. He was not wrong to try. At the small council, he contributed. He brought careful, well-constructed arguments about the realm's finances, the management of the war's aftermath, the political handling of lords whose loyalty required maintenance. The arguments were sometimes acted on and never credited. They disappeared into the council's decisions and emerged stripped of the person who had made them. Tywin moved through all of this with the satisfaction of a man who believes the world is finally arranged correctly. Tywin's treatment of Tyrion after Blackwater was not simply ingratitude. It was a considered policy that served the family narrative. If Tyrion had saved the city, then Tyrion mattered. If Tyrion mattered, the story Tywin had maintained for decades about what a Lannister was, about the clean line of strength running from Casterly Rock, developed a complication it could not absorb. The son managed as an embarrassment could not simultaneously be the man who saved the capital. One of those descriptions had to be false. Tywin chose which one. He had always chosen. The choice was not in doubt. What was new was Tyrion's proximity to the full picture of that choice. As Hand, he had been too busy for sustained examination. In the smaller rooms, with reduced standing and time he had not previously had, the examination was harder to avoid. Shay was still in the city, and the problem of protecting her was becoming more acute. He managed the direction of that attention as carefully as he could, and told himself the management was working. It was not working. It was delaying the inevitable. He knew the difference, and he chose not to act, for he would lose the last, and only person he did not have to wear the armor in front of. Joffrey died at his own wedding feast, poisoned in front of several hundred witnesses. The how matters less than what followed, because the how was never the point. The point was what the room needed in the immediate aftermath of a king's death, and how quickly the room found it in the person standing closest to the body. Tyrion had not liked Joffrey. He had been careful not to let that dislike become something others could use. Had managed the boy's cruelty during his season as Hand with the patience of someone diffusing the same unstable device daily, buying time without resolution. Joffrey had simply been contained, imperfectly, until containment ended with a cup of wine at his own wedding. He watched the boy die. He was close enough to see it clearly. His mind, which had never stopped running even in moments too large to process, registered in the first seconds that what had just happened was going to be used against him. He was right. Cersei moved to arrest him before the body was cold. The logic was simple. Tyrion was present. Tyrion could be argued to have motive. And Tyrion was a Lannister that the family could sacrifice without losing anyone they needed. This distinguished him from every other Lannister in the room. The black cells are different from the sky cells in a specific way. The sky cells use the visible drop and the open air to create psychological pressure. The black cells use complete enclosure and the elimination of light and sound. In the sky cells, Tyrion had argued every morning with the guard. In the black cells, there was no one to argue with. He sat in the dark, waited, and thought about what was coming. What was coming was not a trial in any functional sense. A trial implies a process with an uncertain outcome. What assembled itself in the throne room was a conclusion in need of a procedure. The conclusion had been reached the moment Cersei's eyes found Tyrion across the body of her son. The procedure existed to dress an execution in the close of a verdict. Pycelle came first, the man Tyrion had arrested, stripped of his chain, and sent to the black cells during his time as Hand. Pycelle did not fabricate. He selected. He took true facts and arranged them in an order that produced a false picture, which is the most difficult kind of lie to disprove because you cannot establish innocence by confirming that the individual facts are accurate. Tyrion sat through it without speaking. Cersei's other witnesses followed in sequence, each one another brick in the same wall. Lords who had attended meetings where Tyrion had said things that, extracted from their context and delivered to a room already leaning toward a verdict, could be made to sound like the words of a man capable of murder. The testimony accumulated in the way that tilted proceedings always accumulate, each addition lending credibility to the next. Then Shae walked in. Tyrion had known, in the abstract, that the court might try to use her. He had managed the risk as carefully as he could, and had told himself the management was sufficient. He was not prepared for the specificity of what she said. She had been inside the armor. She had seen the private version of him. The words spoken in the register people use when they believe they are not being observed. The things said in rooms where the performance was supposed to be off. She described those things accurately. She used the word his family had always used for him, the word he had spent his life trying to drain of its power. Coming from a stranger, it would have stung and passed. Coming from her, from inside the knowledge she had been given, it was the precise instrument the trial had been waiting for. Not evidence that he had planned a murder. No one in the room seriously believed that. But evidence of character. Evidence that the person who had been closest to him had looked at what was there and seen something worth condemning. The court watched his face. He did not give them what they were watching for. He looked at Shae with an expression the people present described differently, depending on what they wanted to have seen. Whatever it was internal. He held the testimony in silence and let the trial continue. There is a version of this moment where Tyrion plays it carefully. He absorbs the verdict, performs the contrition the room is assembled to receive, appeals for mercy, and survives. He was intelligent enough to do this. He had spent 30 years building exactly the kind of mind that can find the available exit from a room, including rooms designed to have no exit. He had time to prepare. He had been sitting in the defendant's seat for days, watching the case assembled, knowing its construction with complete clarity. What he did was not a reaction to sudden emotion. It was a deliberate choice, made in advance, to stop performing something that had become unbearable to perform. He looked at the judges. He looked at the lords who had eaten at his table, received his counsel, benefited from his governance, and were now sitting in careful neutrality, waiting to see which way the verdict settled before arranging their expressions. He looked at his father above all of them, the man whose face had been the audience for every argument Tyrion had ever made, and who had returned every time the same assessment: insufficient. He began to speak, not with anger, at least not initially, with exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a specific belief for 30 years and has decided, in this room, to put it down. The belief was that if he made the argument well enough, assembled the evidence carefully, delivered it at the right moment, calibrated the register precisely, the judgment would change. That belief had structured everything: the governance, the battles, the careful management of every room he entered. The armor had been built to protect it. The wit had always been in its service. He put it down in front of the court. He told them he had not killed Joffrey. He said this not as a plea, but as a statement of fact, delivered with the weariness of someone who already knows the fact is irrelevant to the outcome. He told them he wished he had. He said this directly, in front of his father and his sister and the assembled lords, and the room inhaled sharply in the way rooms do when someone says the true thing in a space that has been carefully arranged to prevent the true thing from being said. He then told them about the other trial, the one that had been running his entire life, without a courtroom or formal charges, in corridors and at dining tables, and in the specific quality of his father's silence whenever he entered a room. He had been on trial since birth for the crime of surviving when his mother did not, for existing in a form the Lannister story could not use. He had been convicted without examination. He was done performing innocence for a court that had issued its verdict in the first hours of his life. The room went still. What he said next was not a catalogue of grievances assembled for effect. It was the precise, pointed assessment of a man who had spent decades studying the people in front of him and had reached conclusions he had always been too careful to deliver. He told them what they were. He told them what the court was. He told them what the Lannister name had actually meant, from the inside to the person the family had treated as its least member. He was not reckless. Recklessness implies losing control of a situation. He had not lost control. He had decided the cost of maintaining control was no longer worth paying. Control, in this configuration, meant continuing to perform a version of himself that had just become impossible to sustain. It meant appealing to his father's mercy. It meant investing further in a process that had already returned its conclusion and was simply waiting on the paperwork. He had been paying that cost for 30 years. The Sky Cells had not changed the judgment. Blackwater had not changed it. 6 months of competent governance had not changed it. Shay's testimony had not changed it, had instead made the performance of continued deference physically intolerable. He stopped paying. The demand for trial by combat followed logically. Having made reconciliation with the court's mercy impossible, he had one mechanism left. He knew the law, had known it in the Sky Cells, had found the crack in the wall then and used it. He found it again now. Trial by combat, his right, irrefusable. The demand meant something different here than it had in the Vale. In the Vale, he had demanded it to survive and then do something else. Here, there was nothing waiting on the other side. He was not demanding trial by combat as a strategy. He was demanding it as the last available refusal, refusing to be executed by a verdict he had not accepted, refusing to let them use their own procedure against him without his using theirs in return. The form of the right still mattered to him. This is the most revealing detail. He had just spent the speech dismantling his faith in the court's justice, naming it for what it was and what it was for. And then, having done all of that, he turned to the law and demanded that its stated procedure be observed. He could not abandon the mechanism even after he had stopped believing in the system. The argument, the right invoked correctly, the crack in the wall found and used, these were the only instruments he had ever had. He was not ready to give them up even in the moment of giving up everything else. The room had no choice but to grant the demand. Tywin had prepared everything except an answer to an ancient right invoked publicly in full court. Even he could not dissolve it without dissolving something the realm needed to remain solid. Oberyn Martell had come to King's Landing convinced that Tywin Lannister bore responsibility for the deaths of his sister and her children, and that no accounting had ever followed. He had been looking for a way to place that grievance in front of a public audience for a long time. Tyrion's trial gave him the mechanism. He came to the Black Cells and offered to serve as champion. He was direct about his reasons. He wanted the Mountain in a public fight, one that could not be quietly suppressed, where he could demand a confession that would tie the murders back to Tywin, drag into the open what everyone in Dorne believed and no one in court wanted spoken aloud. Tyrion was the occasion that gave him the arena. Tyrion accepted. He accepted because the alternative was death, and because Oberyn was the most capable fighter available to him under the circumstances. He also recognized something in Oberyn's directness, the same quality he had always valued in Bronn, the same willingness to name the transaction for what it was, rather than dress it in performances of loyalty he did not feel. In a trial built entirely on managed testimony and performed devotion, this honesty was notable. Oberyn was winning the fight. He was fast in the way that men who have trained for a specific purpose their entire lives are fast. Not just generally skilled, but calibrated for this exact situation. He moved around the Mountain without opposing his mass, looked for gaps, delivered damage, and withdrew before the Mountain could respond. The crowd watched. The judges watched. Tyrion watched from the defendant's platform with the stillness of a man whose life was in someone else's hands and who had no means of helping. Oberyn put the Mountain on the ground. The fight was over, except that Oberyn did not want only to win the fight. He wanted the Mountain to say Tywin's name, to give a public, witness confession that the murders had been ordered from above. He stood over the fallen Mountain and demanded the words. The words did not come. He moved closer to demand them again. The Mountain's hand found his ankle. What followed was fast, in a physical sense, and not fast in any other. Oberyn fell. The Mountain, who should have been finished, was not finished. Tyrion watched the winning position become a losing one, and the pivot between those states was a single human need. The need for acknowledgement, for the truth to be said aloud, rather than merely established by outcome. Tyrion had lived inside a version of that need his entire life. Guilty. The word settled into the room with the permanence of something that had been decided long before it was spoken. Tyrion heard it and looked at his father's face above the judges and understood exactly what had just happened. Not the verdict. The verdict was procedural, a formality. What had happened was the completion of a process that had started the night he was born. He had spent his life bringing arguments to the judgment his father had made about him. He had brought every available argument: governance, military competence, political intelligence, the city's survival. None of it had changed the judgment. There is a point in most lives where a single night's actions change the person so fundamentally that who they were before and who they are after are not the same person in any meaningful sense. Not every life reaches that point. Tyrion reached his on the staircase of the Tower of the Hand in the early hours before dawn, on a night that had already cost him more than he expected to still be able to lose. He should not have been free. He had been in the black cells. The trial was over, the verdict delivered, execution waiting on a date. Jaime came, the only member of his family who had ever extended genuine affection, opened the cell door that should not have been openable, found the passage through the castle walls, and gave Tyrion the exit. Varys was waiting below with the passage east. The way out was clear. He did not take it immediately. He went up the stairs. The decision was not a plan. He had just watched Shae stand in the throne room and confirm every version of what his family had always said he was. He had spent the speech dismantling 30 years of careful performance. Now he was free, with a passage below him and his father somewhere above. The staircase to revenge was there, and he climbed it. He found Shae in his father's bed. She was wearing the necklace he had given her. He had not yet fully processed her testimony from the courtroom. There are things too large to absorb in the moment they arrive, and what she had said in the throne room was one of them. He had been in the defendant's seat. He had needed the speech, the demand, the mechanism of survival. He had managed the testimony by deferring its full weight until the immediate crisis passed. He was in the room. What happened is not easy to describe cleanly, because it was not clean. She reached for a knife. There was a struggle. The necklace he had given her became the instrument. He used it. He stood in his father's room with Shae dead, and did not run immediately. He looked at what he had done with the same directness he had always brought to difficult truths, without the softening that a different kind of person might have found. Then he found the crossbow on the wall. He took it. He loaded it. He went to the door that led to where his father would be. He found Tywin exactly where the layout of the tower and the hour of the night told him he would be. What passed between them was brief. Tywin used the same word he had always used for Shae, the word that dismissed her, that dismissed every woman Tyrion had ever reached toward, that reduced whatever had been real between them to nothing worth considering. It was the last word in a very long argument. The crossbow released. Tywin Lannister, who had spent 60 years constructing and maintaining an image of absolute composure and authority, died on the privy without the image, without the chair, without any of the apparatus that had expressed his philosophy. He died with a bolt in him, in the dark, in the room above the passage his son was supposed to have used to escape. Tyrion descended the stairs. He found Varys. He went into the tunnels under the castle and said nothing. And Varys, who understood what the silence contained, did not ask him to speak. What the night demands analytically is this. Tyrion had crossed the threshold not because he had killed. The world he inhabited was full of men who had killed, but because of what the killing meant for the person who survived it. A man who kills in a sky cell to escape is still the same person outside the wall. A man who climbs a staircase with a crossbow, who passes through his father's room having done what he did there, who fires the bolt into the man on the privy. That man does not come back down the stairs the same. The intelligence remained. The instinct for the argument and the lever and the deal, those remained and would sharpen in the years ahead, refined by the removal of everything that had surrounded them. But the man who had spent 30 years trying to earn his way into his father's story was gone. The judgment he had been fighting was gone too. There was no one left to deliver it. He went east. The man who arrived in Essos, was not the man who had left King's Landing. He no longer had his father's judgment to argue against, his father's court to perform for, or his father's recognition to work toward. For the first time in his adult life, he had no audience. The crate was dark, cramped, and smelled of the sea. He had been in worse places. The sky cells were open to the wind and the drop. The black cells were stone and absolute silence. The crate was simply a box moving across water, and Tyrion Lannister was folded inside it, with his knees against his chest, and the sound of the narrow sea against the hull. When the crate was opened in a candlelit room in Pentos, the first thing he reached for was wine. He drank steadily through the days that followed, with the commitment of a man who has identified a problem and applied a solution he knows is inadequate, but continues applying because the alternative is sitting with the problem at full strength. The problem was not yet something he could sit with at full strength. Varys had arranged everything: the ship, the crate, the introduction to Illyrio Mopatis, the guest quarters. This was Varys operating as he always operated, as the architect of situations other people moved through, calculating the destination several steps before the people inside the plan understood they were moving. He had extracted Tyrion from King's Landing, not from sentiment. Sentiment existed in Varys in small amounts, available when useful. But because Tyrion's mind was a resource, and the cause Varys had been serving his entire career had a use for it, Tyrion understood this completely and allowed himself to be moved anyway, because the alternative was the cell and the sentence and the date that had been waiting since the verdict, and because wherever Varys was taking him was at minimum not King's Landing, and not King's Landing was the only destination he had the capacity to want. Illyrio's hospitality was the hospitality of a man who understood that resources need maintenance. The quarters were large, the food was good, the wine was excellent. The household staff was trained to be present without being intrusive. Tyrion ate and drank and slept at irregular hours and woke in the dark of an unfamiliar room and listened to a city that sounded nothing like anywhere he had lived. He thought about the staircase, not with the circular return of ordinary guilt, the repeated examination of the decision point, the inventory of available alternatives, the question of whether a different choice would have produced a different outcome. He had examined the decision point. The alternatives he could identify were theoretical. The man he had been on those stairs, having just found Shay in his father's bed, with a crossbow on the wall, and 30 years of deferred fury finally finding its object. That man did not have a full menu of options available to him in any realistic sense. What he thought about was the absence. Tywin Lannister had been the fixed point of Tyrion's life, not through love, but through opposition, through 30 years of argument conducted in governance and battle and the management of every room he entered, all of it aimed at the same audience. That audience was gone. Removing the thing he had been pushing against did not feel like liberation. It felt like falling forward. The wine helped with the awareness of this, which is not the same as helping with the thing itself. Varys spoke about Daenerys Targaryen, a young woman in Essos with 3 dragons and a claim to the Iron Throne, and, in Varys's assessment, the best available chance at something better than the current situation. He presented his case in the register he used for everything: reasonable, measured, structured, so that the conclusion appeared to follow from evidence rather than from Varys's design. Tyrion listened and processed it despite the wine, because his mind had never been successfully stopped by wine, only slowed. Varys arranged the next stage of the journey and then removed himself from it, as he always did when a piece had been placed where it needed to be. Tyrion continued east alone, carrying with him the outline of a plan he had not committed to and a name, Daenerys Targaryen, that remained, for the moment, an idea rather than a destination. On the road, he moved without the structure that had defined his entire life. No court, no audience, no father. The absence did not produce freedom in any immediate sense. It produced drift. He drank more than was good for him, and knew it, and continued because the alternative was the thoughts, specifically the necklace, the specific way that something given as an expression of care became, in the right configuration of circumstances, an instrument of harm. He could not grieve Shay straightforwardly. The situation did not allow straightforward grief. So he grieved her sideways, in the spaces between other thoughts, in the quality of the wine's effect at the bottom of the third cup. He went into a brothel in Volantis, not because it offered anything he wanted, but because it offered a room, a drink, and the temporary impression of noise in place of silence. Jorah Mormont found him there, a former knight stripped of his name for slave trading, rebuilt in service to the Targaryen cause, carrying the specific conviction of someone who needs the cause to be righteous, because the alternative is that his years of sacrifice had no justification. He recognized Tyrion immediately, not as a man, but as an opportunity. They did not speak long enough to establish terms. Jorah took him. There was no negotiation, no attempt at persuasion. Tyrion was seized, bound, and removed from the room. The journey east did not begin as a choice. It began as a correction applied to Tyrion's direction by someone with a clearer idea of where he needed to be. He woke on a boat moving east across the narrow sea. The sound of water against wood, the motion of the hull, the knowledge that the destination was being determined by someone else. He had been in worse places. He adjusted. The question the road had been asking, what to be useful for now that the 30-year project was over, was about to find an answer in a city on the coast of Slaver's Bay, where a silver-haired woman with 3 dragons was trying to hold a city together with governance tools she had not been trained to use. He would look at her, make a judgment about what she was, and commit to serving her. That judgment would ultimately cost him nearly everything that remained. He made it anyway. He had spent his entire career believing that the right cause, honestly served, was worth the cost of finding it. That belief had not served him well on the stairs. It had not been proven wrong either. He held it and went east. She was not what he expected. Tyrion arrived in Meereen carrying assumptions built from Varys's briefings and his own experience reading rulers from a distance. He had expected someone who had developed the specific coldness that comes from wielding power at scale. Ambition wearing the language of liberation, conviction manufactured for political use. What he found was more difficult to work around than that. Daenerys Targaryen genuinely believed what she said. Her conviction had been tested repeatedly over years in conditions that would have broken performed certainty, and it had held. Tyrion's entire professional life had been built around finding the lever inside certainty, the competing interest, the cost a certain person had not accounted for, the approach that moved them without requiring them to admit they had changed position. Certainty in rulers is the variable most resistant to this. It absorbs the counter-argument and files it as confirmation. Daenerys was certain the way geological formations are certain, through settled weight, not stubbornness. Meereen was a city in the conditions cities reach, when their organizing structure has been removed before a replacement was ready. Daenerys had taken it with dragons and the Unsullied and the overwhelming force of a cause that the city's defenders could not answer. She had abolished slavery correctly. There is no useful analysis that suggests the institution deserved preservation, and in doing so, had destroyed the city's economic and domestic infrastructure faster than anything existed to replace it. The gap was being filled by the sons of the Harpy, who were killing freedmen and unsullied in the alleys with the steady efficiency of people who understood that the Queen could not be everywhere, and that making the new order feel ungovernable was itself a strategy. Daenerys was absent when he made the decision that would define his time in Meereen. She had flown on Drogon and not returned. The city was ungoverned, the sons of the Harpy still active, the coalition of enemies Tyrion had been trying to manage through arrangement now recalculating what her absence made possible. He was in charge by the logic of practical necessity. He was the person willing to sit at the table and absorb the consequences, which in the absence of alternatives constituted authority. He proposed the 7-year transition to the slave masters, not as a moral position. He was explicit about that in every meeting, as a practical one. The violence would not stop until the masters had something concrete to lose from its continuation. Give them a structured wind-down, enforceable protections for freed slaves, compensation arrangements. Give them something to lose, and the nightly attacks become a threat to their own interests rather than a tactic serving them. He negotiated it. He held the coalition together. He kept the city functional in the gap between Daenerys' departure and return. Nobody remembered this. Competent governance in the gap was the category of thing history does not record. He had governed King's Landing well and been tried for murder. He managed Meereen's survival and would be noted, if at all, as the author of the compromise that failed. When she returned on Drogon, the city rearranged around the spectacle of her arrival. She did not immediately know the full shape of what he had done in her absence. He told her. She was not pleased. The slave masters, having been offered terms at all, even transitional ones, struck her as exactly the kind of accommodation she had come to Meereen to end. She heard the reasoning. She kept the arrangement for the time being, because the practical logic was difficult to dismiss. But she kept it on sufferance, not approval. He proposed reopening the fighting pits, a concession to the city's culture, an attempt to give the population something that felt like continuity while everything else changed. He believed it was the right decision for the same reason he had believed the Myrcella decision was right. Not comfortable, not clean, but the choice that reduced total harm in the available configuration. He sat in the gallery at the Great Games beside Daenerys and was watching the crowd, thinking about the next arrangement, when the sons of the Harpy moved. They moved through the crowd with coordinated efficiency, planned longer than the intelligence networks had detected, supported more deeply in the city's infrastructure than the compromise had bought. The fighting in the gallery was immediate. Tyrion stayed alive by not being where the blades were, moving when movement was required and stopping when it was not. Drogon arrived. Daenerys mounted him and flew. Meereen was left without its queen, its crisis unresolved, its coalition of enemies recalculating what the absence meant. He was the most useful person in her service. He was also, in some fundamental way, the least essential. She could govern without his arrangements. She could not govern without the dragons. The dragons were not his, and had never been his. He had built everything he had ever built from words, intelligence, and the willingness to see what others overlooked. She had dragons, instruments of force that made political arrangements look like minor considerations. He counseled restraint. She heard him, weighed it, and made her own decisions. The ship cut westward through iron-coloured water, and Tyrion stood at the rail watching Westeros approach, with the specific feeling of a man returning to a place so thoroughly imagined in his absence that the physical version can only be approximate. It was approximately right. The cliffs were the same cliffs. The grey sky sat over the grey water with the permanence of a sky that had never considered alternatives. He stood at the rail with the hand's pin on his chest. The pin had been given plainly, without ceremony. Daenerys had looked at him across a table in Meereen and told him he would serve as her hand. The pin appeared later, in a small box delivered by a servant. He held it for a moment before putting it on. This time, Daenerys had chosen him with full knowledge of who he was. Not the Lannister name, but the actual person. The trial, the verdict, the cell, the crossbow, the exile. She had looked at the complete account and decided the mind was worth having. He had been chosen before, by Bronn in a transactional sense, by Varys in a managed sense, by the clansmen when he had offered them what they wanted. He had not been chosen before by someone who knew everything and chose anyway. He did not examine the feeling closely. Feelings examined closely in his experience had a history of becoming complicated in ways that cost more than the examination. The campaign that followed was not the campaign he would have chosen. His plan would have been slower. Land with the full force available, 3 dragons, the Dothraki, the Unsullied, and then stop. Send ravens to every lord who had bent the knee to Cersei under duress, every house with a standing grievance against Lannister rule, every corner of the realm where resentment of the current arrangement was real and available to be converted into something more useful. Build the political coalition before deploying the military one. The military demonstration should be the last resort, deployed only after every political avenue had been exhausted and seen to be exhausted. He laid this out at the painted table at Dragonstone, the same table, the same room, the same map Aegon the Conqueror had used 3 centuries earlier. She listened and agreed to follow it, broadly. Then the fleet burned. Casterly Rock was taken and found empty, and the Reach was lost. The lords of Westeros were doing what lords do when a foreign claimant arrives, waiting to see who was actually going to win before committing, keeping options open, staying available to whichever side ended up with the momentum. He had understood this and been building toward the moment when the calculation changed. The fleet burning and the loss of the Reach reset the momentum in Cersei's favor before the coalition had solidified. He watched the councils change in texture. Not suddenly. No single meeting where the table turned. In the small signals, her eyes moving to the window when he talked about patience. The same question appearing at the end of every analysis he gave. When? When would patience produce results? When would the lords commit? He did not have a clean answer, because the answer was true but not satisfying. Political coalitions develop on timelines that respond to conditions, not to plans, and the timing was outside both their control. She had 3 dragons and the largest combined force in Westerosi history, sitting on a volcanic island waiting for lords to make decisions. Why this felt wrong to her needed no explanation. Varys reached his conclusion before Tyrion did. Varys's premise had always been the realm as a stable entity capable of providing ordinary people with something better than continuous war. He had served that premise through multiple rulers and had withdrawn his support from each one at the precise moment when continuing to support them threatened the premise more than the alternative. He was reaching that moment with Daenerys. Tyrion saw it happening. The ravens Varys was sending, the conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. He saw the calculation Varys was making and recognized it as a version of the calculation he himself had run, arriving at a different conclusion. The difference was not in the information. It was in the premise. Varys served the realm first. Tyrion had accepted the pin and the choice it represented, and was not prepared to abandon the choice because it was becoming difficult. He told Daenerys what Varys was doing. This cost him more in the long accounting than almost anything else he did in this period. He was giving her the information that would get the man who had saved his life killed. He did it because Varys was actively working to undermine the ruler he had sworn to serve, because the oath meant something, and because he had not yet reached Varys's conclusion himself. He could see the shape of where Varys had arrived. He had not decided it was the correct destination. Varys died for his betrayal, seeing a better option in Jon Snow, whose parentage was revealed during this period. The fact of Jon's blood was politically manageable. It required careful timing and patience. The problem was what the revelation did to the relationship between Daenerys and Jon. They had built something real, a bond formed from genuine mutual recognition between two people who both believed in what they were doing. Jon's claim did not threaten Daenerys' claim in any insurmountable legal sense. He himself said he had no desire for the throne. What it threatened was the story she had been living, that she was the answer the realm had been waiting for. Jon's existence meant the answer might have an alternative. His goodness, uncalculated, direct, producing loyalty in people without requiring them to calculate the benefits, raised a question she could not argue with. Why did people follow him with a readiness they did not extend to her? She could not answer that question with better politics. The answer was human and not subject to management. Tyrion counseled against revealing the parentage, understanding what it would do to her. The counsel was followed for a while. The secret did not hold, because people who know the value of a secret tend to use it, and eventually someone did. The North rallied to Jon in the way that people rally to someone they recognize as one of their own. Daenerys had arrived from the east with armies that looked and moved like exactly what the North spent 1,000 years defending against. The North had a long memory. The movement south was not clean. What had been, in the North, a war of survival became again a war of position, supply and timing. The kind Tyrion understood and had expected to manage. But the conditions had changed in ways that made his methods less reliable. Daenerys was no longer arriving as a liberator into cities that could be reshaped. She was approaching a capital that would resist until it could not, and then resist again in different forms. The coalition around her had narrowed. The North had given what it was willing to give and no more. The lords he had expected to declare themselves remained where they had always been, waiting for certainty, waiting for proof, waiting for a victory that had not yet materialized. The timeline he had been working to no longer existed in the same form. The fleet was hit at sea. One of the dragons fell from the sky. The loss was not only strategic, it altered the balance in a way that could not be negotiated back into place. Missandei, one of Daenerys' most trusted advisors and friends, was taken in the aftermath, removed from the field, separated from the structure that had made her safe, turned into a point of leverage. By the time Tyrion stood before the gates of King's Landing, the situation had simplified into something he had spent his entire life trying to avoid. Two sides, both committed, both past the point where the arrangement he would have proposed could be made to hold. Missandei died on the walls of King's Landing, seized by Cersei's forces, executed as a demonstration that the city's surrender was not available on terms that left Daenerys anything she had arrived with. He watched Daenerys' face when it happened. He had watched the Mountain's hands close around Oberyn in the throne room with the same specific quality of attention, knowing that the damage visible in the moment is smaller than the damage that would follow from it. He saw the shift in her face, the movement from grief into the place past grief where the question of cost stops being a variable. He made one more argument. The city was full of people who had not made the choices that brought the war to their walls. The bells meant surrender, real surrender, and what she did after them would define everything that followed. She heard him. She said she hoped he was right. Jaime Lannister had left the North before the war. They had fully settled into whatever came after victory. He had listened to the arguments made for staying. Loyalty, obligation, the possibility of becoming something other than what he had been, and had found that none of them held against the simpler fact that Cersei was in King's Landing and the war would end around her. He rode south alone. The journey was not complicated. The outcome was. He was taken before he reached the city, intercepted outside the walls, recognized, and brought back not to Cersei, but to the camp that had come to remove her. Tyrion was told his brother had been captured and held. The information arrived as these things always did, plainly, without interpretation. He went to the cell. He freed Jaime from the cell on Dragonstone, arrested for attempting to return to Cersei, and sent him into the city. Jaime was the one person who could physically reach Cersei before the battle made everything irreversible. He was crying when he said it, which surprised him. The armor had been coming apart for months. He told Jaime he was the only Lannister who had ever been genuinely kind to him. Jaime went into the city. Tyrion returned to camp and waited for the bells of surrender. The bells rang. He heard them from the camp. Not one bell but the full sound of the city opening at once, every tower contributing, the weight of 1,000,000 people's surrender made audible. He had not slept. He had been sitting in the tent since before dawn, holding the plan. The bells, the surrender, the end of the battle without what he had been arguing against for months. Something in his chest loosened, not full relief. The loosening was the first movement toward it, the body beginning to respond to the signal it had been told to wait for. Then Drogon screamed. The sound came from above the city walls, from above and behind them, and it was not the sound of a creature responding to the surrender. It was the sound of something that had been waiting for a different signal and had found it, not in the bells, but in whatever Daenerys had decided would be the fate of King's Landing. He moved to where he could see. From outside the walls, he saw smoke rising from sections of the city the assault had not yet reached. Then the sounds from inside the walls reached him. Not sounds of fighting, sounds of people caught in something they had not prepared for. He stood outside the walls of the city he had governed and saved, and been tried in and fled from, and he listened to it burn. His predictions had been right. Being right is not the same as being heard. Drogon moved through the city in passes the survivors would describe for the rest of their lives. The scorpion bolt Cersei had positioned, the sort of weapon men had built before in hopes of killing dragons, were mostly fired, missed, and then destroyed. The small folk had been trying to leave since morning, streaming toward the gates with what they could carry. The fire did not sort between them and the defenders. He walked into the city through an undefended gate when the fire had moved past the sections he could enter. The geography was intact, the streets, the buildings, the general arrangement he had known. But the familiar had been made strange, in the specific way that large fires make things strange. He knew where he was going and went there. He found Jaime and Cersei in the passage below the Red Keep, in the collapse that had sealed it. They had not made it out. The castle, the stone the Lannisters had always used as their metaphor for permanence, had had the last word. He cleared enough rubble from Cersei's face to see it. His relationship with Cersei had never been simple affection. It had been the relationship of two people who understood each other very well and used that understanding as both weapon and connection, shaped by the same father into incompatible instruments, spending their lives in the same court, working around the incompatibility. She had tried to have him killed more than once. He had outmaneuvered her more than once. The intimacy was the intimacy of people who know each other too completely to pretend. She was gone. Jaime was beside her, his hand over hers in the rubble. The gesture characteristic of everything Jaime had always been. He sat with them for a long time. The House of Lannister, which had been his prison and his context, and the thing he had spent his life trying to prove wrong, was two bodies in a collapsed passage under a burning city. He was the last one. He had always been told he was the least of them. He had outlasted all of them. He walked back out. He heard about the speech she gave on the steps of the Red Keep second-hand, in the fragmented and contradictory accounts that traumatic events always produce. It was not the speech of a person managing the aftermath of a difficult decision. It was the speech of a person who believed what she had done was right and intended to continue it. The fire over King's Landing was not an error to be explained. It was the opening demonstration of a project. He had been wrong, not about the argument, but about what the argument was aimed at. He had believed that better counsel, delivered differently, at the right moment, could still close the gap. It had not. He had been constructing the conditions for a just reign. By then, the transformation had become the project. The complete removal of every structure she judged to be causing harm, on every continent she could reach. The reign was the means. He had spent months constructing the means of a project he had fundamentally misunderstood. He went to her and told her what she had done. Not as an argument. The argument had already been made and answered in fire. As a statement of fact, the city had surrendered, the bells had rung, and she had burned it anyway. He removed the hand's pin and dropped it. The Unsullied took him. He did not resist. He was taken to the cell, sat down, and waited. It was a room in the lower levels of what remained of the castle. Stone walls, a narrow window, a locked door. Better than the cells he had previously been held in. The window showed him a portion of the city. The smoke thinned over 2 days and was mostly gone by the third, replaced by the specific quality of air that follows large fires. Cleaner than expected, carrying trace elements of things that had burned that were not meant to burn. He sat with this air and thought. He was in a condition he had rarely occupied. No immediate problem to solve, no arrangement to construct. The problems were enormous. They simply were not yet in front of him in a form he could act on. Daenerys had the city and the military force, and had not yet decided what to do with him. A decision not yet made was a conversation still to be had. Jon came first. He arrived looking like a man who had been carrying something heavy long enough that the weight had become the expression. Not bowed by it, but shaped by it. The specific posture of someone who has been placed between things he loves and cannot find a version of the choice that does not destroy something real. Jon had not come for political analysis. He had come because Tyrion was the person most honestly positioned relative to what had happened, and Jon needed honesty the way other people need food, not as a preference but as a requirement for continued function. She had done what she had done and intended to continue doing it. The case for stopping had been made at the highest quality available. It had not been sufficient and would not become so. The choice John was facing was real and was his to make. John sat with this without speaking. He had already reached the conclusion. He was holding it in the silence of a man who wants to be wrong and has checked again and confirmed that he is not. Tyrion said what he had been building towards since John entered the room. The people who came after them needed someone for whom fire was not the default answer to every difficulty, not someone incapable of force. Incapability is not restraint, and the realm needs rulers who can use force when force is genuinely necessary. Someone who had been given power repeatedly and had consistently, demonstrably chosen not to use it when the situation did not require it. He looked at Jon Snow. Jon said he would not be king. Tyrion told him that was exactly the right instinct and exactly the wrong decision. The only rulers worth having are the ones who do not want the position, because wanting it is precisely the disposition that makes it dangerous. The history of Westeros is a long record of what happens when the people who wanted the throne got it. That history was visible from the window behind Tyrion's head. Jon did not say no. Daenerys came to him herself, without a retinue, the unsullied waiting at distance. She stood in the cell and looked at him with the expression he had learned to read over years of councils and campaigns and arguments in rooms above the painted table. She was not angry. This was more alarming than anger would have been. Anger would have been the response of someone managing the injury of betrayal. She had moved past the betrayal into the position where it was simply a fact the project had absorbed. She named what he had done, freed Jaime, sent him into the city. She named the outcome. Jaime and Cersei had died in the collapse. He told her the truth. He had freed Jaime because Jaime was the one person who could physically reach Cersei and tell her the truth of her position. That staying in the city meant dying in it, that leaving was still possible. He had known the probability of success was low. He had acted on it because the decision Jaime's presence in the city might produce and the decision the cause required were briefly the same decision. She asked if he had known the chance was small. He said yes. She looked at him for a long time. The geological certainty was still there, the settled weight of her conviction. But something else was present alongside it that he had not seen clearly before, the specific tiredness of someone who has been carrying the full weight of a very large project for a very long time without anyone to share it, and who is beginning to understand privately that the carrying has changed them in ways they cannot see from the inside. She told him he would be tried when the time came. He told her he had been tried before. She left. Jon made his choice in the throne room, the room where the Iron Throne had sat until Drogon's breath melted it. The swords of the conquered returned to formlessness by the same process that had fused them into the seat. Daenerys died there, beside the absence of the throne. Drogon took her east. The realm was in the condition it always reaches when the organizing principle is removed without a replacement ready. Not immediate dissolution, but suspension. The lords were present. The armies were present. Nothing had been decided. Tyrion was brought from the cell. He stood before the surviving lords, the remnant of the nobility after the war, the fire, the attrition of the preceding years, as a prisoner in front of a council that had not yet decided what it was. Sansa Stark looked at him across the gathering with the clarity of a woman who had survived everything the story put her through and had developed, in the surviving, an accurate way of seeing people. She named the record, the mistakes, the scale of them, the visible consequences still present in the smoke and the rubble, and the decisions that had brought the realm to this morning. She was not wrong. He did not argue. He had argued in throne rooms before. He knew the difference between an argument with a lever and an argument made into the air. Sansa's observation had no lever. It was simply accurate. He proposed Bran Stark as king. He made the argument with the same tools he always used: visible logic, connections drawn between premise and conclusion in the sequence that made the conclusion hardest to dismiss. The breaking wheel, power passing through blood regardless of fitness, producing Joffrey and Aerys, and the full history of catastrophic Westerosi succession, required something different. A ruler chosen rather than born. A ruler who held the past rather than the future, who could not be moved by ambition, because ambition requires wanting things that Bran had left behind. A ruler without heirs, which meant a reign without the succession crisis that every reign eventually became. Sansa observed that Tyrion had demonstrated a capacity for catastrophic errors of judgment, and asked why his endorsement of Bran should be treated as a recommendation rather than a warning. It was among the more effective arguments made against him in the gathering. It was accurate and also slightly wrong simultaneously, which is the hardest combination to answer. He was a man with a damaged record proposing something the record could not straightforwardly support, but his record was the one of someone who had consistently tried to serve the right principle. He answered it the only way it could honestly be answered. A man who had made every available mistake was perhaps the person most likely to recognize the right answer when it appeared. The council considered this in silence. Bran was chosen. The moment did not feel like triumph. Triumph implies a clean resolution. This felt like the specific quiet of a problem that has been present so long that its absence requires adjustment. The new silence where familiar weight had been. He was named Hand. Bran delivered the appointment without ceremony, in the flat register of someone for whom the present is less vivid than the past, and who has therefore developed a literal relationship with immediate moments. A fact stated. Tyrion stood in the open air above the ruins of King's Landing, the city he had saved, governed, fled from, been tried in and watched burn, with the hand's pin in his palm. The first time the pin had been a temporary assignment. The second time it had been a choice by someone who knew the full account. The third time it was something he did not have a name for. Not redemption. That implies a debt settled, a ledger balanced, and his ledger was not balanced, and he had stopped expecting it to be. Not vindication. The judgment that had structured his life was not reversed by sitting in the Hand's chair. Not triumph. It was not a clean resolution. His record was not clean and would not become so. But the pin meant that his judgment, however damaged, was still considered worth having. He put it on. The council table was reclaimed timber, old wood from the castle's lower levels, dark from decades in a stone room, carrying in its grain the smell of a place that had absorbed coal for longer than anyone could count. New in the only sense that mattered. Who sat around it? Bronn of the Blackwater, now Lord of Highgarden and Master of Coin, sat with the ease of a man who had spent his career surviving situations designed to kill him, and had arrived at a relationship with mortality that was more comfortable than it had any right to be. He had come a long way from the sky cells of the Eyrie. The sellsword who had stepped forward in a hall full of knights because the terms were right, was now the wealthiest lord in the south by the arithmetic of having outlasted the previous wealthiest lords. He carried the wealth with the comfort of someone who had not grown up expecting to have it, and had therefore not built his identity around its possession. Davos Seaworth sat beside him, former smuggler, former hand to Stannis, advisor through the wars and what came after. He carried himself with the quality Tyrion had always noticed in people who had come to their positions from nothing. A groundedness, an immunity to the court's performances, the specific authority of someone who knew what things actually cost, because he had paid for things with his hands. Brienne of Tarth sat with the careful, upright posture of a person still adjusting to a position her own self-understanding had not anticipated. Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, a title the world she had grown up in would have treated as impossible. The adjustment would resolve itself. He had seen people arrive at unexpected positions before. Samwell Tarly, Grand Maester, brought something previous Grand Maesters had consistently diluted with institutional caution: genuine knowledge. Sam had read everything available to him with the appetite of someone told early that his reading appetite was a failure, who had used that criticism as fuel. He had the specific courage of someone who had encountered evidence that contradicted what he believed and had changed what he believed. This was rarer than it should have been, at that table and at every table like it. They were imperfect, capable of the ordinary failures, blind spots, self-interest operating below conscious intention. They were also something the table had rarely contained. Not one of them had inherited their position. Not one of them had arrived through blood. They had arrived through competence, survival, and the specific accident of still being present when the people who had previously occupied the space were gone. The old system had spent most of their lives trying to exclude them. The woman, the bastard adjacent, the smuggler, the son told he was insufficient, the dwarf. The old system was ash. King's Landing was rebuilding, not according to any plan, but through thousands of individual decisions by people who needed somewhere to be and built it from available materials. He could influence the shape of the rebuilding. He could not direct it entirely. He started with the harbours. The harbours were the city's food supply before they were anything else, and a city that cannot feed itself cannot build itself. He worked on the debt, the enormous, layered, deliberately obscured debt that Littlefinger had spent years constructing, and Cersei had spent years expanding, which now sat on the realm's account, compressing every other decision. Bronn helped with the debt by ignoring the ceremonial aspects of the problem and talking directly to the people who held the notes, finding out what they would accept in exchange for arrangements that did not require solvency in the near term. He was effective at this in the way that men who have spent their careers converting nothing into something are effective. Tyrion sat at the table and brought the analysis and found the levers and built the deals. It got done. Not in ways history would find interesting. Competent governance in the aftermath of catastrophe is not interesting to record. It is a sequence of crises averted, problems redirected before they became catastrophes, situations moving toward bad outcomes that were quietly moved somewhere else. No battles, no dramatic reversals, no moments that make for good stories. This was the change. He had spent 30 years doing good work as a form of argument, proof that the judgment was wrong, that the son Tywin had dismissed was worth more than the dismissal suggested. That argument was no longer available. Tywin was dead. The family was ash and rubble. The audience for the proof, the specific, irreplaceable audience of his father's recognition, was gone. He had feared that stripping away the audience for the proof would make the work feel empty. It did not. There were evenings when the satisfaction of a problem solved did not reach the place where the thoughts about Shay and the necklace and the staircase lived. He had stopped requiring it to. This happens to people who survive long enough and pay attention. He was the last Lannister of Casterly Rock, serving as Stark in the city his family had governed for a generation. The dwarf son of the most powerful man in Westeros, sitting in the Hand's chair for the third time, having outlasted his father, his sister, his brother, the queen he had served, and the dynasty he had been born into. He had been told his entire life he was the family's least member. He was its last, and he was tired. He was also, in his own way, all right. Not redeemed or at peace, but steady. Each day he did the work in front of him, and that was enough to keep things from falling apart. Set everything down for a moment. Let King's Landing rebuild itself in the methodical way that cities rebuild. Stone laid on stone, routines resumed in the spaces where routines had stopped. Let the dragons be absent. Let the Iron Throne be what it became. A puddle of cooled metal on the floor of the room where it stood. The swords of the conquered returned to formlessness. Let the Lannister name rest. It was a name that had functioned like weather. You did not argue with it. You arranged yourself in relation to it. You felt its pressure before you identified its source. Tywin spent his life producing that effect. Cersei spent her life weaponizing it. Jaime spent his life being its most visible expression. Tyrion spent his life being told he was not it. He outlasted everyone who said so. He was born into a story that had explicitly assigned him no role, and he refused every day of his life to accept that assignment. Not dramatically, not with the clean, intentional refusal of a man who knows what he is doing. With the stubborn, imperfect, repeatedly costly refusal of someone who simply cannot locate in himself the mechanism for accepting what he has been told. He found the crack. He made the case. He kept going. The realm required attention every morning. He provided it, not out of gratitude for what the realm had given him, and not out of peace with the powerful, because the task was there and he was capable of it. In a world that had spent his entire life telling him he was insufficient, that was the last word. Not his father's verdict, not the court's, his own. Reached quietly, over years, at the table with the report still in front of him. What remained was a small man at a table, working on the next problem. Set everything down for a moment. Let King's Landing rebuild itself in the methodical way that cities rebuild. Stone laid on stone, routines resumed in the spaces where routines had stopped. Let the dragons be absent. Let the Iron Throne be what it became. A puddle of cooled metal on the floor of the room where it stood. The swords of the conquered returned to formlessness. Let the Lannister name rest. It was a name that had functioned like weather. You did not argue with it. You arranged yourself in relation to it. You felt its pressure before you identified its source. Tywin spent his life producing that effect. Cersei spent her life weaponizing it. Jaime spent his life being its most visible expression. Tyrion spent his life being told he was not it. He outlasted everyone who said so. He was born into a story that had explicitly assigned him no role, and he refused every day of his life to accept that assignment. Not dramatically, not with the clean, intentional refusal of a man who knows what he is doing. With the stubborn, imperfect, repeatedly costly refusal of someone who simply cannot locate in himself the mechanism for accepting what he has been told. He found the crack. He made the case. He kept going. The realm required attention every morning. He provided it, not out of gratitude for what the realm had given him, and not out of peace with the powerful, because the task was there and he was capable of it. In a world that had spent his entire life telling him he was insufficient, that was the last word. Not his father's verdict, not the court's, his own. Reached quietly, over years, at the table with the report still in front of him. What remained was a small man at a table, working on the next problem.